I'm now going to show you a fairly important setting within the program that can have a rather large impact on your scene um, if the option's turned off or if certain units are set. First of all, if we take a look at File Options and go to the Units and Coordinates tab, by default we have one view unit equals 1 meter. This is a good unit to work with for the program. It has basically been designed at this point to work within this unit best. In previous versions of Vue, and I believe it was switched over in version 8 or 9, the unit used to be zero point 0.1 meters. So when we take a look at the content, that'll make more sense why you see some of the scales you do. So we'll just keep this at 1 meter. And what we want to take a look at is under the General Preferences tab, and under Object Options, we have Preserve Size of Natural Elements at Creation. Within the host application, if you're using xStream, this option is not available. You will need to open the standalone version in order to set it. You will also want to make sure that your save configuration upon exit box is checked in order to make sure that that option remains on or off, depending on how you want to use it. So let's go ahead and keep that on for the moment. And what I'm going to do is load in a plant. We'll load in the maple tree. And if we take a look in the numerics tab up top here, and take a look at the size of it, it's about 15.5 meters high. And this is pretty much the intended height of the object. So let's go ahead now and turn that option off. So File Options and turn off Preserve Size of Natural Elements, time of creation, and load in another maple tree. And what we're going to see is something completely different. We have a huge change in the scale. And if we take a look under the numerics tab, this option under the scale, because right here on the left we have position, orientation, and size. So the scale size option, this first checkbox here will show you can turn it on or off. The tooltip's going off screen because I've got more than one monitor. But basically what it allows you to see is whether or not the real world units are being used. That also is a direct connection to the display size of objects in world units just above the preserve size of natural elements at creation checkbox. So actually turning that off will affect every object's display, and turn that option off in File Options. So that's the view unit that we're seeing when we turn that off. But the scale change, what we have is about 10 times larger than the original maple tree. And the reason for that is all the content, or pretty much all the content provided with Vue was created with a unit of 0.1. So 1 unit equaling 0.1, and that's because a lot of the prior versions of Vue were set that way. And a lot of the content, although has been updated, was originally created in that unit. So preserving the size of the natural elements takes down the scale regardless of the unit used to create it, and sizes it correctly. It does a little bit more than that, and one thing I want to show you is if I just create a terrain and just add a quick ecosystem to it. The scale is set to 1 with the option off. Now typically, because by default the option is turned on, we'll turn back on the preserve size of natural elements. And I'm going to go ahead and remove the maple tree and reload it. And it looks like maybe I need to reset the material. and I'm just going to purge the memory. Add an ecosystem, and now what we're going to see, the scale is set to 0.1. So what it's basically doing is entering in the unit that was used to originally create it. So when you see a size of 0.1 within the scene, that is normal scale. And it looks like purging the memory might have deleted some of the textures, so I'm just going to go ahead and just restart Vue really quick. Okay. So here we have the ecosystem again. So when you see that scale of 0.1, which you're going to find with a lot of different things, that is scaled because of that natural size option that is checked, and that keeps things with their intended scale. So even though the ecosystem is set to 0.1 scale, it is really at a scale of 1, or its intended scale. So even that is definitely one thing to keep in mind, is you're not actually scaling it lower than real-world scale. Now, that option has an impact on material loading and terrains and atmospheres, cloud layers, just about all the content. So if I go ahead and reset this material, just right-click, go to Reset for the terrain, and load in, say, the rocks and grass under Landscape, its size is 0.1. So it's doing the same thing that the ecosystems and plants do, because most of this content was created with an internal unit of 1, and since the default was switched over to 1 from 0.1, we see that size change. So just to show you, I'll go ahead and turn that option off, and we'll reload that material, and the size will be set to 1. So you can see that in effect. Now, it also has a huge impact on clouds, just because you're working with some very large scales. And obviously on the plants it was a very large impact as well. If we go ahead and add in a cloud layer, and I'll add the thick high cumulus, and if we take a look at the cloud tab, what we're going to see is that the altitude is at 19 kilometers and the height of the cloud is 9 kilometers. Well, 19 kilometers is outside the troposphere. Troposphere ending around 10 kilometers for the most part. So that is something that's not real world at all. But if we go ahead and set the option and re-add that cloud layer, we'll see that's at 1.9 kilometers. Now, because I changed the unit so much, it didn't stack the clouds like it typically would. So if you're noticing that objects are way too large or not really matching up, make sure that option is checked on. It's a good thing to have on. Another thing that you'll notice with the clouds is there's more of an impact than just the height and size of the cloud. And that is that there is a change in density and the opacity. So if you take a look, density is at 50 with the one we loaded in without that option on, and then it's up at 500. And then it reduces the opacity to about half. So that is another thing that changes, and that is somewhat relative to the way the aerial perspective is set. Now, that scale or density might be a little high with some of the clouds. So if you need to reduce the density a little, you can. But if you notice things are kind of jumping all over the place, a good place to start is with that scale setting and making sure that natural elements are preserved for their intended scale. It does affect the rock species as well, modifying their scale, and any of what they consider, or what ERN considers a natural element, which is terrains and atmospheres, plants, rocks, You'll also find there's an impact on the terrains and the way they're generated. If we create a procedural terrain and we take a look at its size, it is 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. And a standard terrain is going to be the same. Now, there is also an option to define the default size for a terrain, which does have an impact on a couple of different things. Mostly with standard terrains, because the Vue unit defines the intensity of displacement maps. And we'll see that when we look at the displacement maps. But just really quick, what I want to show you is the terrain, just adding a terrain, a regular standard terrain. And actually first I'll go ahead and turn off the preservation of size. We'll create a terrain. Actually, we'll create procedural terrain. And if we take a look at the size, we have 256 meters by 256 meters. Now if we edit the terrain and we take a look at the pixel res, and with a standard terrain, or with a procedural terrain, it only affects the two-dimensional layer, the 2D layer that's used to transform the procedural. For standard terrain, that is basically the actual size, and you can also calculate the polygon count by multiplying 256 by 256, and then once again multiplying that by 2, because Vue takes everything and turns it into triangles and not quads for polygons. So 256 by 256 is the resolution that's creating for the meters. If we right-click on a standard terrain, or if you're using xStream, the height field in terrain editor option. So right-click, we can find the size 256 by 256. So if I set this to 512 by 512, we have that for our terrain. It's going to generate a terrain. Click OK. Now the size is 512 by 512. So that is linked to that option. You also see that the Vue unit between a procedural terrain and a standard terrain is much different. And that does have an impact, which we'll take a look at later. So in a procedural terrain, we'll take a look, 512 by 512. So that's the new default setting. When the preservation is turned off, it will generate the terrain 1 meter equaling 1 pixel. If we turn that option back on, and now create a terrain, it'll be 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, regardless of the terrain and editor setting, or whatever size is set here as your default. So I'm just going to set that back to 256. And every terrain is still going to be created at 1 kilometer when that option is on. There's an additional impact or setting that is modified due to that preservation within a procedural terrain altitude production. If we go in and edit the function, we'll find that there is a multiply by a constant, which is set to 256. Turn that off, go back in, and we'll find 128. And then that's also going to be dependent on that editor resolution. So as we change the default size, it will change that multiplied by a constant value, which is essentially a multiplier in order to make fractals fit within a certain range. Now what I've done really quick is just created a terrain with the editor resolution, or the default resolution 256 by 256, and that multiplied by a constant value is set to 128. And then I went and changed it to 512 by 512 and created another procedural terrain. And now when we take a look, our multiply by constant value is 256. So what that does is it changes the scale and multiplies the vector. It was a little different or difficult to see the change there because of the way the vector happens to be set. And in fact, this is a pretty basic fractal. If we turn on with rotation, adjust that setting a little bit. And now if I set this to 32, we'll see a much different size, or a lot bigger. So this will also change the output of the fractal and the intensity, depending on which type of fractal you're using. So just a couple of different scale things there to pay attention to, because they can clearly have a large impact on a lot of the different elements within the scene, and really to just kind of make sure that if you're running into any inconsistencies between the different presets, that can be an important option. And once again, if you're using this within the host application, you do need to open the standalone version, which you can just open the scene in standalone view within the host application. Go to your options, turn that on or off. Make sure that that save configuration upon exit is turned on. If no changes are made to the scene, it typically won't refresh or allow you to save. So all you need to do is just something very simple within the scene. You can create a sphere and delete it. Move a camera you're not using around. Since only one camera is moved with xStream, you could create a duplicate of the camera, move to it, move that camera, and then go back to the camera you were at before, and then it should allow you to save the scene out. Whichever camera is active is the one that's brought over as the main camera to your host application.